Did Thomas Crapper really invent the toilet? How did Soviet-era famines give us Tony the Tiger? How did Sigmund Freud's nephew use bananas to start a 36-year civil war? You can learn all about these and hundreds of stories in my new book, Facts That Aren't True. Link in the description. What if I told you that the Dunning-Kruger effect isn't real? To help us understand, here's Dave. Hi, Dave. Welcome.
Thanks for having me today.
Oh, yeah, it's my pleasure. Now, we are here because you have null and voided some of my greatest insult moments on my channel by telling me that, or informing me that, yeah, this thing that you and all the other debunkers, the Google debunkers and commenters on the, science education, debunking, debatosphere, whatever, every time you guys have been saying this is Dunning-Kruger, you've been saying something that's technically incorrect.
The worst kind of incorrect.
The worst kind of incorrect. Technically correct is the best kind of correct, according to the, what was that guy from Futurama, the bureaucrat? I can't remember his name.
Yeah.
Level 99 or whatever. So Dave, if you could here, give us a little bit of your background and kind of how you stumbled into this Dunning-Kruger data and how you were able to interpret it and kind of your expertise and know-how around this issue.
Sure. When I'm not doing Minecraft YouTubing, I actually work at Google, and I work on the network edge for Google Cloud. That is pretty much the largest individual network in the world because it is unified. It's enormous, and we run our own. To understand that much information, I need to have a lot of statistical skills, many of which I've had to develop sort of by following courses throughout my time. I only have a computer science degree, a bachelor's degree, so I wasn't fully trained on this. I did get a lot of math. Yeah, the way I fell into this was I was actually learning the stats behind all of the COVID-19 papers because I really wanted to understand what was true and what wasn't during the pandemic. It seemed to me to be a matter of life and death. And I got really into reading a lot of the papers and started realizing how much of the replication crisis is real when several things I believed I had to debunk with my own hands, and I felt real bad about it. But then I realized, actually, this is great. This is super fun. And so I went on to sort of continue to do this. And Dunning-Kruger comes up a lot, and it's very seductive to my type of psychology. And because of my background, I tend to be particularly ferocious about those things. I guess I would say the core insight is really seductive for the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Like you think you see it all the time. The problem isn't necessarily that insight is wrong. The problem is the model that they proposed in Dunning-Kruger is wrong. And the math that they did is so wrong. It's basically an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, which is kind of ironic in its own way. But yeah, the core insight can remain intact. But what they said, which is specifically that your ability to do work influences your ability to judge your work. That was the thing that they sort of laid out, right? And then they have, I don't have it up, but there's that famous graph of like confidence where there's kind of like the hill of overconfidence, and then there's the valley of uncertainty.
Yes.
It's all just nonsense. It doesn't appear to be good at all. It doesn't appear, the problem is it's replicated time and time again, which makes the whole thing very confusing.
Yep. So just to lay out sort of what most of us intuitively understand the Dunning-Kruger effect to be, it's that people with low experience, low expertise in a particular field or on a particular subject or topic will vastly overestimate how much they know, and so they are overconfident in what they say. And they regard their opinions to be just as valid, or if not more valid than the average person's. And experts tend to play down their expertise, and that is thought to be, because they know so much, they're also highly aware of how much at the boundary of what's unknown about this topic is. And so they downplay their expertise on that a little bit. And people in the middle are just kind of in the middle, I suppose.
Right.
And yeah, that's the general kind of idea behind how it works. Now, we'll get into some of this. What's what's really interesting with some of the sources that you shared with me, I'll have some links to those things down below in the description,
Nice.
is I knew that there was this cognitive phenomenon. I don't know what the name of it is, if it even has a name, but the majority of people think they're above average across the gamut of all kinds of things. Most people think they're better than average looking. Most people think they're higher than average intelligence. Most people think that they are better than average at all kinds of skills. And that we know is true. And it appears to be what the Dunning-Kruger effect, what they initially thought was this unique phenomena, was really just that. Do I have that right?
Yeah, yeah, that's
Or
what
at
they
least
sort of said.
that's part of it.
Yeah. Well, so for there's two halves to the Dunning-Kruger graph. There's the people who overestimate and the people who underestimate, right?
Mm-hmm.
On either sides of the spectrum. And so they had a pair of hypotheses for what was going on there. Or I guess interpretations. They didn't really trust them as hypotheses. On the left-hand side, the people who overestimated, they said, well, these people are they share what they called a dual burden, right? It was that they were dumb and they were too dumb to know that they were dumb. That was really their message. And so they
Mm-hmm.
left it at that. And it was, they sort of just like said, oh, well, you have poor metacognitive skills, thinking about your thinking. On the other side, they said, well, why are people underestimating their ability? There must be some psychological factor at play there, which, spoiler alert, I'm not so sure. But they said that's the false consensus effect, which is, I think, what you're laying there. And they said that both of these are equally irrational. It's not clear necessarily that they're irrational, but that is their hypothesis, and I think that's the thing that's most wrong about the Dunning-Kruger.
Okay. And that was something I forgot to brought up. It's not just that people that don't know all that much overestimate what they know. It's also because they're largely ignorant on something, they just underestimate the complexity of an idea. And so the little bit they know, they think represents all there is to know about something. And
Right.
yeah, so are we saying that that phenomena is also not really borne out by the original study as well?
Well, you see, what's interesting about that specific phenomena is that there's really no way to prove it. I can show
Mm.
you why if you'd like, but
Sure.
it's incredibly difficult. Well,
Sure.
so I got a
We'll start getting
presentation of the
into
graph.
the facts and the figures here.
Let's crunch up this graph, right? There's a source in the description, I suppose it'll be there, from an article from Numeracy that goes over this in eye-watering detail. I just kind of boiled it down. But this is the famous Dunning-Kruger graph. And you'll notice that there's kind of a straight line here, and then there's this other line here, and it kind of has this distance here and distance here. And they interpret this distance as the lack of awareness.
Yep.
The problem is, like, you're kind of looking at this thing where there is X, the line of scores, and then there is this other thing they're inviting you to interpret, which is the Y minus X line. That area under the graph is what we're looking at, the area that I've highlighted in orange. So they say there's a psychological effect at play there, or at least one, if not more, psychological effects. But what if I told you we could do this without any psychology at all? So the other thing I want to point out that they did before we start with this that exacerbates what we're about to go over is how many data points do you count on each line? Obviously 4. That's because this was 1999 when they published it. No one had desktop computers. Software for statistical analysis was still, an incredible endeavor back in that day. So what they did was they used a spreadsheet, the best thing they had, and they averaged all the quartiles, the groups of 4, so 0 to 25, for each data set. And they put it together in an average. That's why there's only 4 data points. That really, really gave them a lot of problems. So let's just go ahead and make a reproduction of this graph with no minds at all involved, at least not in the traditional sense. I got a big pool of random data. These are people, if you could pretend, their score is totally random and their ability to guess their score, totally random. This is nonsense.
Mm-hmm.
But if we were to present this data along the order of score from 0 to 100%, we'd get a line, right? Now, you'll note that the orange line is just all over the place. That's their guesses. And that's because there's no, obviously, look at this. It's clear. There's no relation between the orange line and the red line.
Right.
But what if I were to do the exact same treatment of bucketing it into 4 groups and then taking the average? Does this look familiar to you?
So go back 2 slides. So that's a scatter plot, right? And this is to anybody that's kind of seen them, this looks like a correlation of 0, right? You know, a scatter plot, if it had a correlation of, let's say, 0.5, positive 0.5, then the top left of the graph and the bottom right of the graph should be relatively empty of dots. And it would be a wide berth of dots, but they would be going diagonally upward. But this just very much looks like 0. And then you're able to transform this, even though this is random data with a correlation of 0, into, if we go back, into something that looks exactly like the original Dunning-Kruger data. That's bizarre. For non-math people such as myself, that is just utterly bizarre to see that transformation happen.
Yeah, I mean, and I want to lay it out here. What's actually happened, statisticians call it autocorrelative. If we go back over here and we talk about what this is, anytime that you compare a value to itself, every statistical measure that you have out there is going to be like, oh yeah, they're correlated, bro. Because they are. They're the same value, right? So of course they're correlated. But the real thing that's happening here is what we call regression to the mean. If there's noise in our data, as you can see, the orange line is perfectly noise, then what we're looking at over here is the average of all that noise. So every time someone makes a guess, the noise is going to generally draw it back towards the middle of the sample, the mean. Mm-hmm. And so every time someone underestimates, the noise will naturally draw it up. In the numeracy paper, and in other people who have followed up on the Dunning-Kruger effect, they've tried simulating alternative models. I did one that was very extreme, but you can, with just giving a measure that where if someone was able to perfectly assess themselves every time and perfectly guess their score, and you had a whole group of people across the range, but they could all perfectly guess, and then you just randomly gave a little bit of noise to their answers, you still get a Dunning-Kruger curve. Because that is what regression to the mean looks like when you graph it between 2 values. Okay. So, moral of the story, don't interpret these graphs.
Yeah, I remember reading the paper, and I don't have background training in this kind of thing. And I remember it talking about, the problem is when you do that correlation, you're comparing X to X. And that I understand how that would be circular reasoning and how it could recursively reveal a pattern. I understand in some intuitive sense how that would happen. I still wouldn't say I intuitively really understand exactly why it's happening, but I can see that a random set of data produces the same thing that this study was purporting to report on. And well, if complete randomness is indistinguishable from your study, then I think it's pretty clear that the study is flawed. Yeah.
And this is sort of the thing that if you were to go to, say, a university these days and get a modern education in science and statistics, and the statistics useful in experimental design and execution, they would warn you about this, although they don't always mention the Dunning-Kruger effect. So it's well understood at this point that we can't do this. You can't compare one value to itself, but that leads to a really interesting challenge, right? How do you figure out if being unskilled makes you unaware of it if those 2 values are connected? How do you even design an experiment that permits that? Right? If it's going to be flawed because it's circular, as you said, it's a real big challenge. Just like, it's an example of how scientists sometimes have to solve very strange problems.
Yeah. So, where are we at currently with it? So the Dunning-Kruger study is flawed, but the Dunning-Kruger effect could potentially be true. Where are we at with trying to establish whether or not this phenomena is real?
So, by pure coincidence, we were lucky enough to get someone to publish as we were prepping for this, right?
Yeah.
People have looked through and they have tried to reproduce the effect. And for example, in creative endeavor, no one can reproduce any Dunning-Kruger effect. So we already had some evidence that maybe there was something else at play. But when you go and you remove all of the signals, you don't see very strong effects at all. They're barely visible, and that probably is noise. But I think the name of the paper is Overconfidently Conspiratorial. Conspiracy believers are dispositionally overconfident and massively overestimate how much others agree with them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a paper about an alternative interpretation of the Dunning-Kruger effect and a set of experimental designs that actually let them try and recover some of it. And they propose something that I think matches up with our experience of, say, flurfers and, sort of a lot of things in modern politics, but that doesn't rely on bad statistics or circular reasoning.
Yeah. I read that earlier today, and it was pretty fascinating. So basically, with a conspiratorial mindset, what happens is it's not about over assessing your own ability. It's about over identifying your beliefs in the general public. And what that looks like is the conspiracy theorist thinks that 90% of the general public believes in the conspiracy they believe. And when in reality, in the particular paper you shared, it was like 12%. So
it's crazy low.
Yeah, it's crazy. And the discrepancy is enormous. I mean, from 90 to 10, just about, that's about as big as it can get. And that's exactly like the kind of phenomenon we see with Dunning-Kruger. So it's manifesting itself in a similar way, but it's not but it's still different because it's not them thinking, aha, I figured this out. It's them thinking that this is common knowledge when it's absolutely not. It's fringe knowledge. Well, again, you can't even call it knowledge, but
yeah, I guess I have to be true, right? In theory. I think what's fascinating is that they had to design all these experiments to decouple the idea of your competence from your confidence. And so they invented things like one of their things was called the perception test. They just flashed noise. It was just nothing, but they flashed it so fast. And then they were like, was there a dog? And the people with high belief in conspiracy theories, in particular untrue conspiracy theories, were extraordinarily confident. They would always rate themselves at a 4 or a 5. And they were like, yeah, there was a dog, or no, there wasn't. Their performance couldn't be higher than chance because there was nothing actually there. But by breaking the cycle that we discussed earlier, by saying, well, there's no way anyone can perform well on this, you get rid of that autocorrelated property that we saw before. And now you're just measuring their confidence while having them do a task. And I thought that was a really, really cool innovation, right? Like that was like, wow, that's a great experiment design that solves a problem and it's clever, right? It actually tests what we want to test.
I just recently finished this book, Science's Search for the Afterlife. Well, the main title is 6 Feet Over by Mary Roach. Absolutely hilarious and very, very good pop science writer. And something that they do in the book, all the chapters are about different investigations into an aspect of the afterlife. And there's this idea that people can channel or hear ghosts and spirits talking. So they would grab groups of people and they would play white noise. And it's nothing but white noise. It's not even scrambled talking. So there could in a weird sense, there is something there. Just white noise. They would have people listen to it for extended periods of time, and people would come up with, most people would just be like, oh, I heard this word, but some people would come up with entire sentences that they swore were being spoken through the white noise when there was nothing there at all. And that reminded me of what you were talking about with the random flashes of just pure and utter nonsense, right? And people insisting that they're seeing something there.
That's really interesting because you can see how other people have tried to solve the problem, like these problems of measuring people's confidence before and measuring their perception. One other thing they did in the study, though, which I thought was very fascinating and really topical these days, is they said, well, how big is this effect where conspiratorial people overestimate their beliefs? Is it like, does anything shake them out of it? Do they believe that there's maybe some group of people who don't agree with them? And so they constructed this procedure where they said, okay, they'd ask the person, what's your political affiliation? And because they're in America, that's a very charged subject. And they would say, like, oh, I'm a Republican, or I'm a Democrat. And they're like, okay, well, of Republicans, if you're a Democrat, of Republicans, how many people do you think agree with you about this? And they what they expected was that it would be like this belief that was diametrically opposed. They're like, oh, well, we're the virtuous people with all the correct knowledge, and they're the slimy losers, right? But that's not what they felt. They were so confident that they were like, well, I think like 60% of that. I think like 60% of Republicans believe this, right? Or like Republicans being like, I think like 60% of Democrats. And that was really interesting because it means that even if you like show them a group of people who they don't identify with, who they might even be really, really angry at or strongly disassociate with, they will still believe themselves to be persuasive and largely in the norm in that group, like looking at a majority.
Huh. Yeah, it's fascinating. So it comes back to the same thing where they think that what they believe is commonly held knowledge among most people when it's just not.
Yeah. And nothing can shake them out of it. Nothing appears to work.
You can't reason somebody out of an opinion they didn't use reason to form, or however that saying goes. It's always hard to parse it out in simple terms. And there just isn't a good, it always sounds clunky.
And so I think that sort of like the one thing that people might ask is, well, how is this actually any different from what the DK people were doing other than the experiment design? But there is one key difference that we can sort of set upon if we're going to use this in the real world, which is that they're proposing that there's a different causal mechanism. So as a reminder, the Dunning-Kruger folks said, the problem is you're dumb. And that means you can't reason about your reason. Maybe that effect exists, but we don't know how to design an experiment to show it. But what these folks have proposed is the problem is you're like almost absurdly overconfident. Like you're overconfident to the point where it's clouding your ability to even make basic judgments about the world around you. And that means that you will never, ever like engage with any of these problems seriously. Or if you do, you engage in like some very, very quick type 1 thought. I recognize that that's the way it is, go, and you will never back down. Right. And so there's a different kind of mechanism at play that doesn't loop back on itself.
Do you remember what the names of the authors for that new study were?
Yes, but I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce them right. Pennycook is easy. I think it's Binnendijk and Rand.
So I don't think nobody's going to say, I already forgot, the Pennywise Rand effect or whatever it was. I'm sorry, but it's not good. It's not catchy. Dunning-Kruger is, I mean, those aren't like, there are certain names that just have a kind of like presence to them, and Dunning doesn't. Kruger, Freddy Krueger, who are the other Krugers? That's the only one I know. But for some reason, Dunning-Kruger is kind of, it almost feels good to say, you know, and maybe that's part of the popularity of it.
It is super useful to have a word for this idea.
Yep.
And I got to be honest with you. I think that like dispositionally overconfident is a bit of an expensive pair of words to be using in this, right? I don't think it's going to quite land the way Dunning-Kruger is either. Do you have one, perhaps?
Well, there is this new term that I heard recently, and it was Sophommania. So, like sophomores, you're called that because sophos is like wisdom, I believe, or intelligence. So, but the idea of Sophomania still kind of captures the same effect of Dunning-Kruger, where it's a person radically overestimating their intelligence. But we all kind of, like, there are plenty of words where we use them and we don't mean what the word literally means. A perfect example is the word literally. The tables have literally turned. No, the tables didn't go anywhere. Or ironic. Ironic is used, which is true irony, almost incorrectly all the time. And technically, we use the word jealous wrong almost all the time. Jealousy is when you're afraid that somebody's going to take something away from you. Not when
Oh,
you envy what somebody else has. That's the definition of envy. Uh, that's why we have the word envy,
that's a good
right?
point.
And jealous now kind of has two definitions where it is co-opted envious. But maybe we could use sophomania. Maybe we could say to people, instead of you're the living embodiment of Dunning-Kruger, we could say you are being a total sophomaniac right now. And they won't have heard that before. And it's going to rattle them. And so that would be, I actually like that prospect.
I like that too. But I wanted to, before we like wrap, like give you one other piece of insight because I was thinking about this last night. I stayed up way too late actually thinking about it, to be honest. Is it actually irrational to behave this way? Imagine you come off the spaceship, you're on another planet, and they're about to give you a math test. And you're like, well, I know some math, but I have no idea. I mean, maybe the spacefaring society, maybe like it's only some, like priesthood that can make the ships and not everybody's super smart. I don't know. Where would you place yourself? Like, what's the safe strategy? And probably that's like, maybe it's not high, but maybe it's not super low either, right? And if you're in a group of people who you've never met before, um, guessing blindly, guessing towards the middle of the sample is a reasonable strategy. It's what statisticians do all the time, right? They just kind of like randomly pin a normal distribution somewhere that sounds sane and call it a day. So maybe it's actually not irrational to overestimate yourself when you're below the mean, and maybe it's not irrational to underestimate yourself when you're above it.
Yeah, I mean, the being guilty of Sophomania or Dunning-Kruger or whatever doesn't necessarily mean that the dumbest people think they're like, it doesn't mean if you're in the 10th percentile you think you're in the 90th percentile and vice versa or anything like that. It just means you think you're average or above average, really
Right.
above average. And I understand the temptation uh, to call this out for how ridiculous it is, but I am sympathetic that you can't say that somebody who's in a position of ignorance, maybe even invincible ignorance, you can't fault them for not understanding how bad their take is because they're ignorant, you know?
Right.
That and it can be that kind of ignorance can just seem vicious and offensive. But I do understand the what you're saying. That is it not is it not rational to think that you're at least average or maybe a little bit above average? I mean, if everybody does it or the majority of people do it, then it's just kind of human nature. You can
Right.
say unfortunately, but if man is a rational animal, then maybe it's not fair to say that something that's an innate part of our cognition is irrational, perhaps.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, the actual reason that the Dunning-Kruger paper came out, it's kind of an obscure bit of trivia that I came across, was that psychologists were desperately looking for ways to separate out dumb people from smart people in their studies. And someone said, well, why don't we just ask them? They'd know if they're dumb or smart, don't they? And the Dunning-Kruger people had this intuition. No, they won't. And I think that intuition, ironically, has been borne out by the Dunning-Kruger. Like they're actually right, no matter how you leave it with the interpretation of their math. Even if we say, well, all of everything else they've said is wrong, it is correct to draw the conclusion: do not use proxies for like self-assessment for intelligence. You actually have to measure it.
There's this is a little bit tangential, but since we're talking about psychology and flawed studies and things like that, there is this kind of persistent problem in psychology where, well, what psychology studies really, what the data really shows is this is what psychology majors in college think, not what people in general think, because of how many studies are done on undergrads,
Right.
in universities, which is not exactly a representative sample.
Yeah, it tends to skew in a very specific direction.
Hmm. So, what do you think? We've talked about this a little bit, but what do you think we should say and what do you think we should do instead? Because the falling back to Dunning Kruger, it's so irresistible because of how what it purports to be all about. Just it screams out loud to you that this phenomena is real. I see it all the time in people that I talk to. So, what do you think we should say instead? What do you think we should maybe do instead?
I really liked this new paper that I saw because I think it does point to the underlying like phenomena. Like I find it very compelling. Hasn't been replicated, so I reserve the right to be wrong. But the notion that people are just kind of crazily overconfident, right, is there. That has a natural. First of all, calling someone overconfident is not as bad, I think, as calling them Dunning Kruger, right?
Yeah, because you're just
Um,
telling them that they're stupid when you say Dunning
right.
Kruger, or
It's a synonym for
at
stupid.
best, viciously ignorant.
Right. And kind of irretrievably so. But overconfidence is something that you can attack. So maybe that's something where if you find somebody who's not in total bad faith, talking to you, maybe you could just say, have you considered how confident you are? Like you should go out and just find out if other people believe what you believe. Um, because I think that, at the end of the day, people learn things even when they don't want to. This is why a lot of people are told to stay away from people like you, right? Is because you're deceivers, you're liars, you're going to tell them things which are going to make them think. I know the reason that I got out of, I was in a really, really hardcore Christian cult when I was a kid, be like telling us to be jealous of Muslim martyrs because they had real faith and we didn't. That sort of place.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And that was my middle school. And it was conversations like this and people challenging me um with things I couldn't have an answer for, or daring me to go prove a thing. My natural desire to fight that led me into a brick wall several times, and I finally got tired of it and started asking questions. And I sort of realized, wow, actually the number of people who think the way I do is really small. Why is that? Oh, wow, because it's weird, right? And I think that there is something to that. It doesn't work all the time. It doesn't work on command, but I think that maybe approaching people who are willing to engage honestly with this in mind and try to help them overcome an overconfidence surfeit maybe would be better. That's my best guess.
Okay, I like that. Now I can see that possibly a lot of people that watch this are going to think that we didn't debunk the Dunning Kruger effect. We didn't prove that it really was false or anything like that. Maybe you guys are just rewording it or something like that. So let's try to end with for all the data and everything that you've looked at, let's try to just succinctly say this is what it gets right. Here are the phenomena that are true, but here's where it's wrong or its biggest flaws, just to kind of wrap it up.
Sure. So the Dunning-Kruger does get it right that you can't trust self-assessments of intelligence. That's just not a thing you can do. What it gets wrong is its survey design, its math, its conclusions, its causal model, because there actually isn't really a great IQ to metacognition correlation in the literature. None of those things are true. So it's sort of correct by accident. And that's about all you can say. Now, it rhymes with something that we do sort of see in the real world, which is these crazily overconfident people. And
Mm-hmm.
so it gives us a word to talk about that, a thought model, thinking about these people as like, oh, they just don't get how wrong they are. And that's also directionally correct, right? They don't get how wrong they are. They have a belief system that prevents them from recognizing that. So that's sort of correct. It's hard to say that they get much more than that. The ability to reproduce nearly all their work with random data is about as bad as it gets in terms of the replication crisis.
That's
I don't know what you do.
that's what you that's the thing, the most damning thing, because we're saying, yeah, there are lots of elements of it that that ring true and are consistent. And it could be a real phenomena. We just can't measure it. So people go like, well, then you don't know what you're talking about. Well, no, because we can demonstrate that completely random noise produces the same Dunning-Kruger effect graph. Most people are actually more familiar with that graph where it's like it's a dip and then a valley and then it goes up rather than the two slopes next to each other. I'll have those put up earlier on for everybody to see and be familiar, but I think most people can derive how you arrive at one from the other.
Yeah. That graph is, by the way, pure vibes, as we say in the stats world. It is someone. So, yeah, it's like it's XKCD level accuracy, which is to say it looks great, but it is not always strictly visually correct.
I love XKCD.
Yeah, I love them too, but occasionally the graphs are like, I see why you drew it that way. That's not true.
Well, anything else to close?
No, I think that's everything. Other than that, I really encourage folks to go and take a look at the papers. Some of them are a little dry, some of them are not, and it's kind of cool. If you go and chase through the sites, you can actually chase around. Most of this stuff, you just have to practice reading it, and then you can read it. And there are so many things that are wrong. The replication crisis is real, and there's so many things that now you can sit down with a $200 computer and prove incorrect. With just a little bit of time investment. It's kind of how I got into this, and it's shocking.
Yeah, well, that's all very well said. So thank you for discussing this, and yeah, don't stop thinking, everybody. We can't afford not to.